We've reached an interesting time in the PlayStation 5's life cycle, with a potential PS5 Pro shipping this fall, but very few officially announced games, and a deluge of live service projects on the horizon. As we near the midway point in this life cycle, we thought it would be a great time to reflect on the brand. While PlayStation has mainly approached each console generation with an "if it ain't broke, don't fix it" attitude, each new edition has brought some new features, some welcome additions, and some others that are not so welcome. So let's take a look at some of the different PlayStation consoles and highlight the best and worst of what they had to offer. The first three PlayStations brought along with them the latest in disc technology, which was the harbinger of death for cartridges on consoles. Until the Switch came along, of course. However, the most consequential disc-based choice PlayStation ever made was including Blu-ray on the PS3. While CDs and DVDs never really had any competition, the Blu-ray format was initially in a fierce battle with HD DVD. While Blu-ray was the superior option in terms of quality, HD DVDs were less expensive, particularly when it came to each format's respective set-top players. But since the PlayStation 3 was Blu-ray compatible, that meant millions of people had the ability to play them already, much like how the PS2 was the gateway to DVDs for so many. Now, the Xbox 360, an arguably more popular console in the United States at the time, did support HD DVDs if you bought Microsoft's $200 external HD DVD player. The base console only ever supported regular DVDs, which meant that the use of Blu-rays on PS3 allowed for games of that generation to fit on a single disc, which was not the case for Xbox 360, which saw many of its games coming packaged with multiple. LA Noire was like 4 discs. Wow. By early 2008, HD DVDs were no more, and were all the better for it. Thanks, PS3. Before we move on from the PlayStation 3, let's talk about its potentially worst feature, Sixaxis. A year prior to the release of the PS3, the Xbox 360 launched with its iconic controller that was so good, the updates that Microsoft has made to it for subsequent consoles are essentially small tweaks and improvements. And then the PS3 had Sixaxis. While the controller looked like the DualShock 2 that preceded it on the PlayStation 2, Sixaxis was anything but. The biggest disappointment about the Sixaxis controller was that it lacked rumble, thanks to an ongoing lawsuit Sony was wrapped up in at the time with Immersion, a company that claimed the DualShock controllers infringed on some of its design patents around haptic feedback. Funnily enough, Immersion had also sued Microsoft for the same thing, but while Xbox decided to throw caution to the wind and include rumble in its 360 controller anyway, PlayStation was more cautious and launched the Sixaxis without it. Not only did this lack of feedback suck, but the controller felt way too light. On top of this lightweight, imbalanced tragedy, the Sixaxis controller featured Sixaxis, the motion control technology that was the controller's namesake. That's right, years before PlayStation launched its attempt at a Wiimote motion controller fad, the Move controller, Sony was already dabbling in motion controls. The Sixaxis controller allowed for movement and rotation across the 3 axes X, Y, and Z. Why not 3 axis, you ask? Because 3-axis is not a palindrome, you idiot. Anyway, this shit sucked, and compared to what Wii was doing with motion controls, it already felt outdated at launch. The worst part was that the implementation was mandatory for some games, at least at their launch, as a few titles eventually patched the requirement out. To throw a grenade with some actual precision and direction in the first Uncharted, and to walk across beams, you needed 6-axis. In Killzone 2, 6-axis was required for turning valves and aiming with a sniper rifle. And don't get me started on Quantic Dream's Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls. Sony would later release the DualShock 3, which added back in rumble after the company squared things away with Immersion, but it still kept 6-axis motion controls, which very few games went on to support. You know, while we're on the subject of haptic feedback, let's talk about the PlayStation 5 DualSense. Now, while many will have a preference regarding thumbstick layout and whether or not they like the DualSense's adaptive triggers, the haptic feedback of the controller is undeniably the best rumble in a controller ever. Even nearly 4 years in, I'm still amazed at the variation of rumble you can get out of the controller depending on what is happening on screen. While most of the DualSense's innovations might not knock it out of the park, the haptics are a home run, and I'm hoping it sets the rumble standard for controllers going forward. I mentioned that not all the DualSense's innovations knock it out of the park, but the worst foul the controller makes is its built-in microphone, and if it's not the worst design choice PlayStation has ever made, it's certainly one of its most questionable. Aside from the fact that this is just a bad microphone, it presents a bunch of privacy issues, namely that the mic is on by default and does not make it clear whatsoever that that is the case. This caused major problems when games like Destruction All-Stars, a PS5 exclusive, launched with in-game chat on by default, which meant that every match you jumped into in the game's early days had every player's mics hot without them knowing, and it was a big problem. Thankfully, developers have managed to sidestep this issue by muting by default in the software, and fortunately, you can permanently disable the mic within the PlayStation 5 settings. However, since I'm recommending that every owner of a PS5 do exactly that, what better argument that this controller mic is just a terribly executed feature. Before the DualSense, we got the DualShock 4, which was the biggest switch up to the DualShock line of controllers. It had some silly ideas, looking at you, Lightbar, some ideas that were a mixed bag. Hello, touchpad. But one really great addition, the share button. With the touchpad replacing the functionality of the select button on previous controllers, Sony took the opportunity to add a button capable of instantly capturing screenshots and videos. While the benefits of this addition weren't immediately obvious, as PlayStation was touting a whole suite of tools to edit videos as part of the PlayStation 4 software, which, by the way, did anyone actually use those? Anyway, the ability to quickly capture and share funny clips or great gameplay moments with friends and online is now a staple of gaming in 2024. And for me personally, as someone that makes gaming videos for a living, it's an almost necessary feature. The Nintendo Switch and Xbox Series consoles now both have buttons on their controllers with similar functions, but they both pale in comparison to the versatility of what you can do with the revamped Create button on the DualSense. Seriously, Xbox, you're going to make me jump into my capture library to confirm my screenshot or capture actually worked? And Nintendo, only 30 seconds of screen recording max? Look, I love the PlayStation Vita. It was a genuinely great handheld, and it's a crime that Sony never followed it up. No, the Portal does not count. The Vita's main problem was that it was trying to reinvent the wheel. It made sense considering that Sony had to compete with Nintendo handhelds, which at the time were doing wacky things like adding second screens and glasses-free 3D. But the way PlayStation should have competed with Nintendo was simply by focusing on a good portable PlayStation. Instead, the Vita was chock full of unnecessary features like multiple cameras and the return of Sixaxis motion. But by far, the most useless feature of the Vita was its rear touchpad. Like all gimmicks of its ilk, rear touchpad functionality in games was incredibly limited and eventually forgotten by developers. Which is a damn tragedy, because as silly as it felt to tickle the back of your console, Tearaway utilized it wonderfully by making that console tickling an extension of how you interacted with its handcrafted world. In fact, Tearaway was the only game to really utilize every goofy feature the Vita offered in a meaningful way. There are several reasons why the Vita failed, one of which being the unnecessary inclusions to hardware that jacked up the price, the rear touchpad being the poster child for those decisions. If PlayStation could have got the device down to under $200 and maybe developed a couple more first-party games for it, we might have gotten that Vita 2 we all so desperately wanted. Oh, and the proprietary memory cards that cost an arm and a leg for like a gig of storage, those things can get So there you have it, some of the best and worst features PlayStation consoles have ever had. What are some of your favorite or least favorite choices Sony has made with its hardware? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you next time.